most original and creative talent in our business. Would you welcome Mr. Orson Welles?
Ladies and gentlemen, Orson Welles again, come to call for another visit.
Good evening. This is Orson Welles.
Stay tuned.
Right after this episode,
for our discussion.
This is Orson Welles, come to call for another visit about people and the things they're doing all over the world. Among other things, we're going to talk today about comic books, of all things. We'll get to that in just a minute.
People who know refer to Lear as the name men fly by. The reason is Lear has been famous for fine aircraft radios for more than 16 years. Lear radios are flying the airways from coast to coast and from Alaska to the tip of South America. Very soon now, you'll be able to buy a Lear home radio, built with all the skill and unusual craftsmanship that have developed through years of this unique experience. It will be a radio replete with the very latest developments radio has to offer. For example, there's sound on tape recording. It's like wire recording, but many steps ahead. Tape costs less, and unlike wire recording, the tape does not have to be rewound. You can play what you record right back. Recordings you cherish, you can keep for a lifetime. Anything you don't want, you erase from the tape simply by recording something else on it. Sound on tape is just one feature you will find on Lear home radios. So watch for the name Lear, L-E-A-R. Now back to Orson Welles.
We send you a radio if you send us a letter we can use on this program. And this week, a radio, a 5-tube table model, made by Lear, goes to Mrs. Frances Izell, who lives in Hollywood, Florida. This letter, she writes, is about a subject that you'll probably agree with, but won't think tactful to discuss on the air. But it's one which I, as both a mother and a magazine agent, can speak about with authority. It's these trashy, cheap, and often depraved magazines that are coming into our homes and very definitely into the lives and thoughts of our children. These magazines which hide under the name of comics. I've known at least 3 concrete examples of bodily harm to children as the result of their reading them. If mother forbids them in the house, Junior reads them at a neighbor's or at a corner drugstore. I've heard a juvenile court judge in a large city say that they're a contributing cause to juvenile delinquency. Have you any suggestion? Well, Mrs. Izell, I don't like comic books any more than you do, but I don't like censorship either. How about a national boycott of all places that sell that sort of book by the Parent Teachers Association, other similar groups? Churches would certainly be glad to help, and the newspapers ought to get behind such a drive. As you point out, you can't forbid Junior his penny dreadful. It won't work any more than forbidding Junior's mother and father to take a drink. Prohibition is a bad principle. The answer, of course, is education. Junior must be taught to like something better than the comic books. This won't happen until the biggest salaries in our land go to the teachers instead of to movie actors and radio speechmakers. Teaching is the highest profession a man or a woman can aspire to. And since we live under a profit system, the highest profits ought to go to the best people in the most important job, and the most important job is teaching. When you hear somebody ask whatever happened to Mary Smith, and the answer comes back, poor Mary, she seemed so promising, but she never amounted to anything after all. She's teaching school. That's all wrong. The answer ought to be, oh, Mary, she really made good. She's the pride of the family and the big breadwinner. She's teaching school. As to the juvenile delinquency, Mrs. Izell, I really don't know. I frankly find it hard to believe that a dime novel ever turned a kid into a Jesse James. I think there's juvenile delinquency because we aren't giving young people enough good and fruitful things to do outside of school hours. And because school itself is too often not a place for preparation for life, but an empty distributor of facts, most of which are made to seem quite useless, and some of which are. The vital statistics of juvenile delinquency, the prime causes like bad housing and so on, are too well known for mention here. Maybe we grown-ups, who are supposed to be running the world, keeping the whole works going till our children are ready to take over, are falling down on the job. Maybe, from the young people's eye view, this is a pretty uncertain and insecure place to grow up in, this spinning globe of potential atomic ash. Maybe, Mrs. Izell, the delinquency is ours. And frankly, Mrs. Izell, I can't leave this scandal of the comic books without a word of praise for the comic strips, the good ones, I mean. And these include the benignly documentary Gasoline Alley, the socially conscious Joe Palooka, and the wholesomely picturesque Prince Valiant. Personally, I'm a pushover for an adventure strip called Terry and the Pirates. And the day is blank and dreary without it, I can tell you. Indeed, when my government, my movie studio, sent me off to South America for a sabbatical year of goodwill ambassadorship, I found it necessary for my happiness that Terry be clipped out of the stateside papers and forwarded down to me in the jungle and the pampas and whatever. You either go for comic strips or run away from them. But however you feel about the darn things, let me urge you, Mrs. Ezell, to sample Terry for a while. It's drawn and plotted with high skill, and the people who live in it are perfectly marvelous. And although you wouldn't care about that, the girls are, well, they're wonderful. But this doesn't go for the current heroine, Fob Cobb. In my view, she's an unintentional sister of Hot Shot Charlie. As far as I'm concerned, Miss Fob Cobb can perish in the snows of North China, where she's presently wandering in a horse blanket and a money belt. I am also crazy for the delectable burlesque of Mr. Al Cap's Lil Abner. And you'd better know the whole truth, Mrs. Ezell. I never miss Dick Tracy. I don't really like Dick Tracy, but then I don't really like peanuts, and I cannot resist them. Turning now from the comic section to the front pages. Since Mr. Truman inherited the leadership of our nation, and in the most crucial term in its history, he seems to have been making a specialty of picking little men for big jobs. Of all the president's poor choices, none is poorer than Jolly George Allen, including even John Snyder, who doesn't believe in the reconversion program he's supposed to direct. Allen, court jester to the kitchen cabinet and good friend to the big corporations, is getting his appointment to boss RFC's $10 to $15 billion without having to answer anything like the kind of policy questions fired last year at Henry Wallace. Those who would fight Allen are Wallace men, and therefore Ickes men, Roosevelt Democrats, such as are still left in Washington, and they're too busy fighting another presidential pal, oil millionaire Ed Pauley. What about Pauley? 5 reliable witnesses under oath have called him 5 varieties of liar. Maybe they were lying. I wouldn't know about that. I do know that Pauley's an able executive, a nice guy, and a good friend of mine. According to one school of political morality, that means I should stand by him when he's in trouble. Well, if Ed Pauley's ever in personal trouble, I will stand by him, but I won't stand still for his appointment as Undersecretary of the Navy. The Navy wants oil reserves in the huge offshore deposits in California. Ickes wanted federal conservation of that national wealth. Pauley wants to give jurisdiction of the oil beneath the ocean and in the tidelands to the states. California, the most important, is Pauley's state. He admits he went into politics there to elect the kind of state legislature he, as head of the independent oil companies, could do business with. I don't want that kind of business done by anybody in the cabinet. Ed Pauley raised a lot of money for the Democratic Party, some of which, by the way, paid for some of my radio speeches in the last campaign. Not for that reason, but because he's smart and strong-minded, I agree with the man we both, in vastly different degrees, helped elect to the vice presidency. I agree that Ed Pauley deserved and can fill a good job in government. But nothing remotely connected with oil. No, thank you. Mr. Harry Truman says, yes, thank you. Beginning with his stubborn loyalty to his reprehensible boss Prendergast, Mr. Truman has been striking firm and determined attitudes in the defense of his friends. I wish he could be just as firm and determined in the defense of issues, the FEPC, for instance. I wish that staunch and angry loyalty could be given in the same generous measure to the program he's sworn to support. Well, what a good friend Ed Pauley's chances now. Harold Ickes doesn't fight with a pea shooter, and last week he leveled some pretty heavy cannon at the White House. When the smoke clears, what'll be left? It's anybody's guess. Administration big shots are huddled in emergency conferences today, and they're telling each other, this can't hurt us much. The best bet on their strategy is that an outright liberal be put up for Ickes' job. Republicans, of course, feel Ickes did them nothing but good this week, and lots of it, and some Democrats think the old curmudgeon betrayed his party. Others believe that any betrayal was by Truman, who should have stuck by the difficult but great Secretary of the Interior instead of to the affable oil man. Truman has reestablished the Wartime Wage Stabilization Board, but he hasn't established any formula for wage price adjustments, and that's the heart of all differences between labor and management. But if the executive order is vague, the new stabilization administrator, Chester Bowles, is not. He's a good man, and so is Paul Porter, who's the president's put up for Bowles' former position as head of OPA. So, it turns out Truman's appointments aren't all bad, and neither is the news. Our State Department tied up the Nazi Guild of Argentina's dictator Perón in a neat blue paper. That news is fine. More good news is that tomorrow 125,000 U.S. steel workers are going back to their jobs with a wage increase of 18.5 cents an hour. Everything's going up. Wages a little and prices a little less, we hope. If Truman stops Snyder from stopping Bowles, we may be able to hold this new bulge in the old price line without letting it burst. We hope. A word from London, but first, your attention, please, for an interesting announcement.
In telling you about Lear home radios, I always try to emphasize the word home. Because up to now, the name Lear has been known best for aircraft radios, which Lear has been making since way back in 1930. But now the name Lear is on fine home radios. So you can have a make of radio that only flyers got before. Some Lear home radios will have television. Some will have an entirely new remote tuning control. Some will have the new sound-on-tape recording. There will be FM and shortwave on a worldwide scale. And here's a surprise. With all this, Lear home radios are not high-priced. A handsome console combination with every feature, including television, runs about $500. And down at the other end of the list, a trim, capable table model sells at the $19.95 level. But just remember this. No matter what you pay, you're going to agree with us that you get the most for your money with Lear. L-E-A-R. Now, back to Orson Welles, whose views and opinions are his own and do not necessarily represent those of Lear Incorporated.
In London, the tumult and the shouting dies, the captains and the kings and the foreign correspondents depart. What was it all about, Daddy? Well, son, the Russians and the British kept calling each other nasty names and making up and shaking hands and calling each other some more nasty names. Nothing came of it. British troops are still in Greece and Russian troops are still in Iran. Russia lost the last round over Java, and the first meeting of the United Nations Council came to an end as T.S. Eliot prophesied the end of the world, not with a bang but a whimper, perhaps more accurately, not with a bang but a veto. The minutes look like our own congressional record after a bad session. Of course, the government of the United States has weathered quite a passel of bad sessions, and maybe, just maybe, the government of the United Nations can survive bad sessions too, but there's a difference. The states, the senators and congressmen represent, function under a federal government backed up by an army. Until all nations are placed under the check of a global federation backed up by its own army, Joe Stalin and Joe Patterson and G.I. Joe and all the Joes in this worried world are quite right to be afraid that war may come again, and not with a whimper but a bang. As the UNO glumly packed its bags in London today, the U.S. started something called Brotherhood Week. With the anti-discrimination FEPC bill moldering in its grave, it seems a little early to celebrate. Until we're willing to make laws against race hate, all the fine speeches like this one are merely good intentions. So many paving blocks on the road to the literal, living hell of fascism. On the eve of Brotherhood Week, the Senators Wheeler and Johnson opened the America First campaign of '46 with radio blasts against the British loan. We seem to have heard it before, but the senators are saying again that our neighbors' troubles are no business of ours. On this Sabbath, which opens a week dedicated to brotherhood, we can't help but remember the first brothers who ever lived in the world. It came to pass, you may recall, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, goodbye for now. Please let me come to call again. And thanks for this time. Until then, speaking for my sponsors, the makers of Lear Radio, the radio we give you if you send us a letter we can use on this program, I remain, as always, very literally and very sincerely, obediently yours.
This is ABC, the American Broadcasting Company.
Well, hello again. This is Buck Benny speaking. I'm excited because I'm joined by Vincent Longo. Hey, Vincent.
Hello,
And what's the name of your son again?
Jordan.
Jordan. And then we have Kathy Fuller Seeley with us too. Hey, Kathy, how's it going?
Oh,
All right.
doing great.
And then we're just gonna. This is a different, interesting podcast we're going to present for you. Of course, on Orson Welles, he starts talking about comic books a little bit, and so and and it talks about juvenile delinquency in comics and things. So one of the things known for it, and I'll get all into that as we go. Um, but one of them that ties in really well is Tales from the Crypt. And Tales from the Crypt was a comic book back in the late 40s into the early 50s. And then it was made into a television series for HBO, I think, or HBO or Showtime. I think it was HBO. Um, in the 80s, 90s, somewhere in there. Might have been the late 80s, early 90s. And all those episodes for the whole series of that show are on YouTube, and so you can just watch them for free back to back to back. Um, I'm going to do a link to the very first episode. No, I'm not going to do a link. I'll do a link to that series on YouTube so you guys can watch it. There'll be lots of links in the show notes today, because just in case people want to find out more about these, there'll be links to comic books you can look at in PDF, and there'll be links to the television show. But after we're done talking, and of course we'll have Orson talk first and then us, so we're coming on after Orson. And then after we're done talking, I'll present the very first episode of Tales from the Crypt, so you can watch that and get an idea as to what sort of the things I'm going to be talking about today. But anyway, we'll go through and see what folks thought of this episode and what it brought up and things. I think I'll head over to Kathy first to find out, Kathy, what stood out in this episode to you, or yeah.
Well, it seems to me that like in many of the Orson Welles commentaries, he's stuffing an awful lot into his share of the 15 minutes that's not about Lear radios. And so he's going from this a letter from a reader about the evils of comic books to his own love of comic strips, to going back to talking about political issues in the news, his discussion of what Truman's administration is doing, and things like that. So the listeners will get the usual everything all at once with that. But I do appreciate the several episodes in which Orson is mentioning, I think he calls it the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices what an act that Congress was trying to push. But it's an early civil rights act of trying to get fair employment practices, and especially picks out minority and African American populations. And this is where 1946, the conservative white backlash to attempts to bring civil rights to the forefront in this post-war period is getting its first serious pushback. And so historically, it's interesting to think that this is going on 10 years before Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement we think of in the 50s. So just to give us an appreciation that the struggle was so long and faced so much pushback, that no wonder by the mid to late 50s and by 1960, young college students were so fed up, and they said, you've been trying to make changes, you older generation, for nigh on to 15 years. We're going to do something different, and we might see some parallels to what's going on in current politics. But
Sure. Oh yeah. I forgot to mention, I mentioned before we even started the show, but we'll mention it here. What the heck? We know in our current times, this is 2024, the summer of 2024, the longest July in all of political history, probably. At least it seemed like gone for a year and a half, just that 1 month, with how much ground was covered. Biden stepped down. He had Kamala Harris step up as who's running for the Democratic Party. She just chose her running mate. Believe me, I'm not going to get all into politics here. I'm just going to say, because it ties into something. Uh, After she chose her running mate, who is, what's his name again? Walls?
Whoa.
Yeah, Tim Walls. So she chose Tim Walls, and I'm watching the Morning Joe show the morning after. And Joe comes on and he says, "Oh, I was watching him. It was so interesting watching him and do his first speech and everything. His mannerisms are so unique and everything. You know who he reminds me of more than anybody else? He reminds me of Jack Benny." And he goes into a good 2 minutes of on Jack Benny and the way Jack Benny stands and his hand gestures and the way
All
his
comes
sense
back
of
to
humor.
Jack.
I was like, oh my gosh, I usually people that are going to reach back, because Jack is so similar to Johnny Carson, they usually think it's Carson they see. Most people don't step it all the way back to Jack. I was so impressed with that. And then, about an hour later, in the show, one of his guests comes on and they say, "It's so interesting how you were talking earlier, because I was struck by how much he reminded me of Jack Benny as well." And so then the guest goes into how much he seems like, and I was looking at him and watching his, and like, I don't see it that much. I mean, I could see a little bit of it, but I just thought, hey, we
Right.
talk about Jack Benny here a
Any
lot, and it's
mention
like,
of Jack
okay.
Benny is a great thing.
Yeah. So it makes me want to watch him more when he's giving speeches and things, to see if I can see Jack Benny within this vice presidential candidate. Um, anyway, let's go over to Vincent and get Vincent's thoughts on this show.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this show is one of those reminders that everything we think is new is really old, and that's in a lot of ways. One, I think the centerpiece of this, although, like you said, it's actually only 5 minutes, it's only about a third of this, is about comic books, which is Wells uses as a larger discussion about the effects of media on children, which is, this sort of cyclical fear-built cycle of discussion. But the other parts, which we'll start with, is about politics. And there's really three focuses here that I think are all very interesting. One is, Wells is always obsessed with he's obsessed with Congress and the president, but he's really less obsessed with the president and more obsessed with the people that the president surrounds himself with, the cabinet. And we see this here, where, again, it ends up being this Democratic infighting mostly, but it's Wells sort of taking to task all the what does he say? The big jobs that Truman assigns to little people. And he really takes to task a bunch of other people. I mean, one of his big issues, and I think Wells really gets at the heart of, some of politics' greatest questions and problems, which is the dichotomy of appointed positions. On one hand, Wells particularly takes into task this guy named Ed Pauley. And, this will be a trend in these episodes. This it's for the couple weeks that Wells does this, but he's like, "Oh yeah, Ed Pauley's my friend. He's a smart guy. He's really great." But Ed Pauley is also bad for politics, and he says basically Ed Pauley is this big guy in oil. He's super smart. He should be in the government, but he shouldn't be anywhere connected to oil. But of course, Ed Pauley's in it because he wants, his own business to do well and his friends to do well. The other side of the coin that Wells mentions, though, is he's like, at the same time, I also understand that the only reason that I was able to campaign, the only reason why FDR had money, is because they're so connected to these businesses and their money. And that is this constant tension and issue in politics, because you can't just run a grassroots campaign and get these small little donations from little old people in Saline, Michigan, for example. You have to be in bed with these big businesses who have their own issues. And so Wells, I think, does an interesting and albeit admittedly conflicted discussion about the pros and cons of dealing with Ed Pauley. I do like, he's always like, yeah, we're great friends. And then he just sort of like takes him to task in every way, which is something that Wells is not afraid to do in this show. The other thing, like Kathy said, I think that's really important to mention. I think we mentioned this in another episode. Wells rarely is, a burning Democratic liberal. He rarely mentions Republicans. This is not, I think he just sort of thinks it's not going to change. He has no control over that. But we start to see here, particularly around the civil rights issues, the fracturing of the Democratic Party, particularly with the Southern Democrats who end up getting spun off in particular. So we see that here, and this is the episode. No, that's the next episode where he talks about Abraham Lincoln. But we see, again, all this discussion about the fracturing of the party along these lines. The other thing that I thought was particularly good or worth noting, two things. One is that this section, unlike most sections of these radio episodes, he has a good news section, which is so uplifting for Orson Welles. He's like, look, I have good news. Of course, it fits along, some of his main issues about the fascist government in Argentina. He thinks is, getting under wraps by the United States government. He also mentions at one point a raise that all the steel workers are getting. And of course, you'll hear it in this episode that it's 18 cents raise. Everyone should note that's about $3 today per hour, which is, pretty substantial $6,000 a year in today's money raise. So, yay for the workers, which, as Kathy mentioned, is a big push here, both for wages as well as fair employment practices. The last one that I want to see what everyone thinks. We have the United Nations today, but it's not, I don't know, Wells seems so hopeful in the United Nations, and that's one thing that really stuck out to me in many of his episodes. But today he mentioned something that I really didn't think about, and I don't think about much, which is he mentions two things. One is that Wells is a believer. He didn't really like nations as an idea, and so he really wanted this governing body to take away the idea of nations. He has this episode of another show he does later. I can't remember if it's Around the World with Orson Welles or the other one that he did. But he talks about how he doesn't believe that passports should be a thing. We should just be able to go from country to country and, without being policed. But he mentions here that one of the reasons that we have war and problems is that there's no, there's no strong United Nations, but B, the United Nations does not have an army. And he believes that if we created a central army for the United Nations that could go and solve problems, that we would have more peace. And I think that's a really controversial idea, obviously, because then you could have a real unfettered world power. But I was surprised to learn, and maybe you both knew this, there is actually kind of a United Nations army running today. It's each member nation of the United States, or the United Nations, sends people to be in this army, and they go and do things that other armies don't want to do. I had no idea. I looked it up. They're famous for their blue helmets. I think there's 70,000 active right now.
Wow.
But they don't do what Wells wanted them to do, which is essentially hold everybody in check. There's often talk about a centralized court system where they actually have power to, put world leaders in prison. World leaders famously laugh at that, which does exist. There are, tried for war crimes, and Vladimir Putin says, LOL, good one. So, he I feel like it's, again, what is old is new and what is new is old in this episode. You get to see that politics runs, sadly, very similar today as it does in 1946.
Well, I think it's so interesting with NATO and things, how so often America becomes, okay, we don't want to be the police officer of the planet, so we'd like somebody else to step up or more countries to step up. But then when that ever happens, we immediately are like, no, we're in charge. So we can't, it's this what we'd like it to be, but what we accept it as is two different things. And it's just, it sure looks like America, we either lead or don't want to be involved. So it's like, then I guess we lead. And so that's kind of what it seems to fall back to.
And this is the moment where Americans are having to come to grips with that. And just racing to the finish of the Second World War. I love when Orson continues to talk about fascists, because the whole country's attention has just been whip-smacked over to communists, from the horrible fascist evil to, the horrible communist evil. But just as you all have been saying, it's just at this moment. And as Orson keeps talking about the bomb, it's the winning of the war, and pow, in a flash with this horrible new weapon, that we find ourselves, whether we want to or not, having to be the world leader. And suddenly, with this new the Russian power and the communists coming together to be the other country that wants to be world leader. And so it's also new to Americans who had wanted to be so isolationist. And I think it's still a tension in American politics.
Exactly.
Again, just as Vincent has says, what goes around comes around. What's old is new again.
Right. Well, and then I think anyone from this time in the 40s it was such a question, what's going to happen after this, to see what NATO and what us all, our countries having each other's backs, would create a world without major wars. They would have wars, but not world wars. From that time up until now, what are we, 80 years later? It's like, I'd have to say anybody who look at that would say that was an unqualified success as to how we've avoided for that long. And it's so interesting because now we're at a point where one of the folks running for president thinks that we should not do that anymore. And the other folks think we should. It'll be interesting to see where our country goes. And I don't know. Sometimes they go, okay, do you really want to disturb the apple cart that's worked so well for so long? I don't know. And then how much of it is just talk? And it ends up being that we are going to be in NATO no matter what, or we're going to be involved no matter what. I don't know. But I'd say I think we'll take us into the comic book piece of this a little bit. The first thing I want to mention is I don't get the idea. He read many comic books. I think he was a reader of the Sunday papers and the funnies, and he mentions a lot of them. So I would be surprised that Orson read as many of the different series as he did. He rattles off probably 6 different series. And then at the very end of it, I love it because he says something about, and the rest is just Peanuts or something. And Peanuts, which is the biggest comic ever. I mean, really, with Schultz coming up with that, but Schultz wouldn't come up with it for another 4 years. So he wasn't trying to mention it, but he inadvertently mentioned the biggest comic series that would happen after that. But he mentioned a lot of the others, Gasoline Alley, and just a lot of these various ones that he mentioned. Yeah, right. And they're excellent series to go back and look at those. And it's so nice with the internet now, you can find where folks have a huge collection available that you can look at on PDFs and things, and at least get some flavor for the comics that he was reading at the time. The other thing I think is always funny when I think about these, I think anyone at any given time could go into a comic book stand that would have the comic books, and if you just bought all of them for a given month and put them in a box and gave them to your grandkid, he'd be able to pay, he'd be able to cover a number of months of his house payment by selling those at this point. I mean, because they've all become so valuable, and especially in great condition, that it would be, it was just, they didn't know what they had, that they had something that would be lasting. But let me go.
And they could only have that because 99% of everybody threw them away.
Correct.
Or loved them until they disintegrated. So value comes from rarity.
Yes.
And so
well, it's like I remember the X-Men in 91 or something came out with the first new X-Men series in forever. And it sold the most any comic had ever sold, like 7 million copies. Well, most collectors, I think I have 7 copies or 8 copies of that comic, and so does everybody else. So that comic is probably worth 10 cents, like the original comics were, because it's the same thing. It's a supply and demand thing, right? Anyway, I'm going to go a little bit.
So tell me, what is, I'm not a comic book fan. Tell me, what is, why are comic strips okay? What is this deal with comic books?
Okay, let me get into it a little bit.
Enlighten me.
I'm going to give you a quick history sort of comic books really quick because it ties into everything. So what they're talking about is juvenile delinquency in comics and the link between the two. And there's never been a good solid link between the two, but they thought there was, and certainly they were noticing at this time frame, 46, 47-ish, is when we would get into some weird comics. And we'll talk about how that goes and where it comes from. The main comics we know of today are DC Comics, which are your Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, Justice League, The Flash, Green Lantern, all of those guys, right? And then the other comic company you know about is Marvel, and Marvel puts out the X-Men, the Avengers, Iron Man, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four. Those are the two big things. To start with, neither of those existed. To start with, there was one man named Max Gaines, and Max Gaines was had some access to comic strips, the comic strips that are in the newspaper. They were back in the newspaper in the day. They've been in newspapers almost forever. That someone would come up with a comic strip, and 4 or 5 panels that they'd work together. A lot of times they were one panel that would just be kind of like Far Side, where it would just present one concept in that panel. And Max Gaines said, well, what if we put them together in some sort of book format and put them out there for people to buy? And so they tried that. I believe at the beginning they were black and white, and they put out these black and white and they sold some to kids. I mean, certainly this is during the Depression and things where they first start coming out, really. And Gaines says, well, I have two color presses from what now that take this with a grain of salt, because this is what I've heard and I don't know how it all works, but supposedly he has two color presses, so they each can do black and white. But he said if we link them together, I could do 4 colors, and with 4 colors mixed and matched, you create a multicolor comic book. It's not just 4 colors, it's the gradients of those 4 colors, and you got the prime colors that lead to other colors and everything, right? So he starts producing these comic books. I think originally they were like 64 pages long, and he sells them for 10 cents. And they start selling, and all they are is reprints of the Sunday strips and the regular strips and comic strips, right? Well, then they start saying, well, we have to pay like for these strips, and we have to, what if we started producing our own things that are designed to be in comics, and maybe they're longer form, because instead of having it be just a few panels and then you're on to the next strip, it's like, what if it was 3 or 4 pages long or 5 pages long or whatever, and you had all these stories back to back? So they start releasing those, and they sell really well, because historically it's like your parent goes to a store and is shopping for something, and you're like, oh, can I get this for 10 cents? And even in the Depression, they would go, oh, 10 cents, that's not too bad, we can pay 10 cents. And so they would buy it for the kid. So kids start to read comics. Well, then they start producing more and more kind of mystery, all sorts of things. Comics have always tried a million things. And then someone decides, well, what about if I was to do something? I think it starts maybe with the shadow and things like that, and then someone looks at it and goes, well, what if we did more of a superhero thing? And then they came up with Superman, and Simon and Schuster, I think, came up with Superman, and that became a big seller, right? And so then from Superman, everybody starts copying that, all these different companies. There's all these little companies out there that are producing things, and then you get Shazam, and you get your Captain Americas, and you get all of these things happening. This is course, 38, 39, 40. We go into the war. When we go into the war, soldiers are buying the comic books. Kids that have been grown up in the 30s go to war, become teenagers in the 40s and head off to war and things. So they've got those folks reading their comics. As the war ends, they're like, okay, these superhero comics aren't selling so well. Archie's still are. The humorous stuff always sells, so we're going to make humorous stuff. And then they start looking, well, where else can we draw inspiration from? What can we try? Well, in 1942, suspense becomes a radio show. And we have The Whisperer, we have The Whistler, we have a lot of different radio shows where there's like a host that presents horror type things. So comic books start to morph into the horror sort of genres and suspense. And I think that's more what freaks parents out. So parents are already going, this superhero stuff, my kids all into Superman, that's all they read. I want them to read books and they want to read comic books. And so there's already some of that talk. But then when it starts to get into horror, they're like, I don't know. And the horror titles are so interesting at this time as they're segueing from superheroes into it. So you end up with Captain America's horror stories or Captain America's mysteries. And so it's still got Captain America. Shazam does the same thing. I think Shazam starts to morph into horror. Blue Beetle goes into horror. I think Blue Beetle, becomes Cobalt Blue, and then Cobalt becomes Cobalt Blue horror. And so the morphing of comics, I think, is so interesting. Let's go back to Max Gaines now. Max Gaines, unfortunately, he's a real strong head of the family. Okay. And he's putting out his most memorable books he's putting out are probably like Bible stories, Picto Bible stories that go, and you probably saw them maybe when you were younger at like the dentist's office and things. They would actually still have these books sometimes. They sold them to dentists and to doctors, and they sold them to churches and all over the place. Well, so he has a real strong hand. His son is sort of an inward kid somewhat, I think, and thoughtful, but has this domineering parent. And in August of 1947, so just next year from where we're at, right? We're in 1946, 1947, he dies. And so all of a sudden he's gone, and he's got this publishing company, and his son takes over. Well, his son's now, as his dad dies, his son's 25. So his 25-year-old son looks at everything and goes, we've been like not making much money lately, and we need to try some different things. And his son is big into radio programs, and he's like, okay, what if we take radio and really apply it to comic books? So we have somebody that introduces the show. And what's so interesting is he took what existed and he slowly morphed it into something else. So like there's a comic called what's it? A Moon, a Girl Romance is the title of it. So he takes A Moon, a Girl Romance and starts going, well, there's a moon in there. We can start turning it towards science fiction a little bit. And so he starts to play with science fiction amongst the romance sort of thing. And then it becomes Moon Girl. So he drops the romance piece, and Moon Girl becomes this science fiction-y woman. And then he's like, well, we don't want to be tied into just having to do that. So he starts to broaden things out. So all his titles always slowly morph. You had saddle romances that became Western Justice. And so everything just all of a sudden, it costs money. Apparently they had to pay some minimal amount. It was like $100 or something to create a new comic to start distributing new comics. So they decided instead of doing that, they'd have like issue 15 would be a moon, a girl romance, and issue 16 would be Moon Girl, and issue 17 would be interesting science fiction stories, and or the title would change completely, but the numbering would stay the same. So you had these weird things that would morph into things. But anyway, I'll show you some of them. So Vault of Horror is one that he comes up with, and Vault of Horror is he ends up with 3 books that are 3 comics that comes out every month. One of them is Vault of Horror, one of them is Tales from the Crypt, and the third is Haunt of Fear. And they all have essentially the same sort of stories. You open them up and there's there'll be you have your cover, and then you end up with you have a 8-page story. Here I have them collected in black and white. This is how they were originally released when they were reprinted. They reprinted them this is from the 1980s, I think, a reprint of it. But then he starts going in other places like we've got science fiction. This is Weird Science. The EC Archives is one that is out now, and you can still get this. They first came out with hardbacks. You can't, I don't think, get the hardbacks. Well, you can get them. They charged originally like $40 for these, and now I'm sure they're going for $150 or $200 or something like that. But you can get paperbacks just like this. In fact, it looks just like this on, you go to Amazon, you can get these. They're like $12 a pop for, quite a few, 5 issues, 8 issues, I don't know, of the comic. Great deal. You'll enjoy them. Science fiction ones are really interesting. Lots of great science fiction stories they tell. And then they came up with, and I said that they were looking at like your suspense stories. So we got shock suspense stories. And in Shock, what's kind of cool, and this has a foreword by Steven Spielberg, it shows that this was some history making that was going on. So they, each volume of Shock, which I like, and I'll do a link so that you can get to the Shock PDFs and look at some of those if you want. The cool thing about Shock is it's got one war story, one science fiction story, one horror story, one crime story. So it's a sampler sort of the whole series. And the war stories sold really well at that time. So they had Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat by EC. So they have all of these things they're producing, but he's like, I want to produce something I'd be interested in reading and I want to create. So he would help write them with Al Feldstein, who was the main writer. And they'd just sit and they'd come up with these ideas. They'd have springboards, and they had a file full of ideas, and they just go, okay, here's an idea. Let's go with this one. Okay, I can do an 8-page story on that. That's great. Give me another one. And they would come up with a bunch of stories in just an office meeting every day that they would have. And then Al Feldstein would go off and write the rest of the day to write out all those stories. And it was amazing how many stories they produced in that amount of time. Now, the Tales from the Crypt, like I said, became a TV series. I'm going to link after this to an episode of that so you can look at that. It's from the first volume of Tales from the Crypt, which wasn't called Tales of the Crypt yet, but it was called Terror from the Crypt, something like that. Anyway, but the second, and I'll link to that, and the second comic that's in there, if you look in that issue, the second story is the same story that I'm going to be presenting after our show, the one from HBO. So, and I think it's called, his name was Death, or He Was Death, and it's about an executioner and him going through and not feeling guilty about what he does, but that maybe he should feel guilty about what he does. Anyway, interesting stuff. And so they create these things. Everybody starts to get worried about them, like, oh my gosh, they're really dark. And of course, it seems like whenever somebody does something like this, they lose perspective, and it becomes, how far can we go? So the early issues are interesting, are great storytelling. The later issues, while still great and great storytelling, get darker and darker and darker as you go. The one that, and Frederick Wortham creates a book called Seduction of the Innocent in 1952, 1953. And one of the ones that he goes off on, and there's really no defending it, is they essentially, the story is about a baseball player, and this is so often the case. This is kind of a generic sort of where their stories go from. Usually it's like a baseball player that's cheating on someone else's, one of the other players on the team sort of thing, or murders that person's wife or something. There's something that they do that's this bad thing. Then what's the retaliation they get is one-upping that usually, and that's how the story sort of like, oh, the twist at the end, how are they going to get this person back for what they've done, for the evil that they've done? Well, in this case, which is, I'm telling you about the ultra extreme, okay? This is only one issue. This is one story and one issue that they get pegged with, but I'm sorry, they wrote it. So they take this person, this guy, not only kill him, but take all of his body parts apart. They string out his intestines along the baseline of the baseball to make the baseball diamond, and like his heart is like home plate and his liver's on first, and so they have, and they play a baseball game and run the baseball game on top of this guy because the team is so angry with him that they all kind of go insane and do this thing. But you could see how people would go, okay, this is for a 10-year-old to read. This is, and I'm not big into censorship, but I get their point to some extent. So what they do is they they create a comics code. And what was so funny is EC Comics, on their issues, they would have the little symbol here, over there, of the comics, of the first comics code. EC was part of creating it, and it was like, whatever, we're just gonna go and go, oh, sure, this has been approved by somebody. But they decided, okay, they had Senate hearings with Frederick Wortham there. Bill Gaines had to come defend his comics. He didn't do the best job of defending his comics. He tried. Anyway, so they write this code that bans, let's see, here, let me show you. It becomes where you
What year is the code?
The code is probably right after that. We said the book came out in 52. The code is either 53 or 54, right? Probably 54. So they can't use words like shock on their cover. You can't use weird on your cover. They have weird science, weird fantasy. You can't use weird. You can't use horror on your cover. You can't use crypt on your cover. You can't use haunt on your cover. So they essentially, when you look at everything that was banned, it was like, okay, we're attacking you as a publisher, you, Bill Gaines. We're going to make it where you can't publish any of your comics. So initially he tries, and for a few months he shifts gears, which was admirable, to shift gears or try. And so he creates incredible science fiction instead of weird science, right? It's the same stories essentially, because those stories were never weird or bad or whatever. Some of them would push the envelope, but some of that, he pushed the envelopes in all sorts of ways, creative ways, wonderful ways. He has a story about where you never see the guy out of his helmet. The whole time he's in his helmet, and he goes and lands on a planet and finds out that this planet that they have one set of species that they treat well and one that they don't treat so well. They have kind of slavery with one. He's trying to teach them that that's not okay and that they shouldn't do that and so forth. And then he goes to leave and he takes off his helmet, and he's a black man under his helmet. I just thought, for the time, that was pretty creative, pretty ahead of its time to use. Now, what it does actually, when he does that and takes off his helmet and he's black, you realize, oh, I've seen almost no black characters in all of EC Comics before that, so it really stands out. And it's like, it would be nice if they would kind of have incorporated more of that. But anyway, but there's lots of stories like that. So anyway, they try and change gears. Like I said, they create a book called Pirates, and it's about pirate stories instead of their war stories because they can't do war stories anymore. They create a book called Impact that is sort of like your shock suspense stories and things, but some of them are watered down, some of them aren't. They've got one where Hitler still lives and things. It's one of the great stories, but it was really done before that and then incorporated into the book. They said we're going to put it in there anyway, but they still were getting where they wouldn't display their product, and a lot of times they get returned still, all the issues still wrapped all together, like, okay, they were never ever put on display even. So after a while, he's like, I don't know what to do. In the midst of all this, he comes up in 52, probably. I think it's 52, with just one of his titles. It's a comic book title, and it's called Mad. And Mad starts selling really well. And then everybody copies it. So somebody's got Madhouse, Cracked, Crazy, even EC, which is Bill Gaines's company, copies it and creates one called Panic that is like Mad, but it's theirs and is really quite good. So what they decide to do is he just throws his hands up and just says, I'm done. This comics code is just making it impossible to tell good stories. I can't have zombies. I can't have blood. I can't have all these things I can't have. If I take Mad and put it on the magazine stands as a magazine instead of a comic book, there is no code. I can do whatever I want. And honestly, I'm not going to push the bounds anymore of the dark stuff because I'm just going to get in trouble. So he creates Mad. And actually, now that I think about it, he also tried to take his whole line of horror, all of that stuff, on the magazine stands. It didn't sell very well. So within a few issues, I think they had 4 issues of most of it all dropped off. But Mad sold even better on the magazine stand. So, and at the same time, I believe Playboy's coming out and things is just starting up. And so there's this kind of drive to have a more mature magazine sort of thing, and Mad somehow ties into that. So Mad starts this crazy run where he's making more money than he ever did off his rest of his line, and he just focuses on Mad, and he takes all his creators that were creating all these other comics and puts them on Mad. Unfortunately, one thing that he does is a little strange. The person who created Mad is not Al Feldstein. It's one of the other writers, and Al did the Takeoff, which is the Panic, right? But as they go into magazine mode, he doesn't. I mean, Al and Bill have been working hand in hand together so much that he decides, okay, I'm just going to hand it over to Mad Magazine, to Al Feldstein's going to write it. And so then the original writer of it has to go and create his own. He ends up creating one called Humbug that sells okay. And he also starts writing for Playboy magazine and things, with incorporating their comics and stories in there and things. But Al Feldstein stays in charge of Mad. So Bill and Al are working on it together throughout the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, all the way up into the 80s. And then they decide to retire sometime in there, maybe into the 90s. But Mad just keeps going and going and going. So it ended up turning out okay for him. But that's where Orson is starting. And it always amazes me with Orson that he could just be on the very beginning or the tip of something and see it and recognize it and talk about it. But the whole backlash isn't for another 5-6 years. So he's at the very, they've just noticed this is when comics, like I say, are starting to change from the superhero to the more horror, more war, that sort of thing. And so he mentions it, and that's how it gets mentioned. So anyway, so that's how that whole piece happened. And then out of that, all the companies, like I say, started selling horror books and things because it's what was selling. And the heroes went away. The only heroes left after about 48 were Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and that's basically all you had. Then around 56, they decide, and no coincidence, they can't produce the horror titles and the war titles anymore. So they're like, let's try and re-kickstart the superhero titles because we can at least produce those. So then you get the Renaissance, which is called the Silver Age of comics, where the superheroes came back, and you have your new stories of the Flash, you have your new stories of Green Lantern and how they happen and that sort of thing. And Timely, that was producing Captain America, Submariner, Human Torch, becomes Marvel, and Stan Lee kicks off with his Fantastic Four. He's about ready to quit. And so his wife just says, look, you've always said you should do comics the way you want to do them, the superhero story the way you want. She says, you're about ready to quit anyway. Do it. Just produce some of the comics you want and see what happens. And so he makes Fantastic Four that has more arguing and more adult sort of conversations and things between the superheroes. And it sells like crazy in 61-ish. And then he tries and does Spider-Man, and that takes off. And then he just starts going and creates all of Marvel in a period of about 5 years. He creates this whole thing that you see in the Marvel universe of films. That's the stuff that Stan Lee created in that just short time span. And it probably wouldn't happen if they didn't ban all these horror comics and everything. So that's sort of an overview of comics. And like I say, check the show notes if you're into any of that and you want to read. I'll connect to Dr. Wortham's book that you can read the PDF for it. It's interesting reading for sure about his thoughts on homosexuality. And he thought that Batman and Robin were homosexuals. He thought just a lot of interesting theories. Some of it you could see pieces of, some of it were probably pretty accurate, and some of it was pretty inaccurate, depending on how you look at it. Like I say, I'll connect you to some of these EC comics so you can look through and see what they were like and see what we're talking about. Such an interesting time we live in when we have these Orson Welles that have been lost for years. We have comic books available that you can look at as a historian and go, oh, wow, this is interesting stuff. We've got, I've been playing a bit on the Internet Archive a lot. And my goodness, the amount of films they have, they're just wonderful, wonderful historic films that you can look and experience. Just so much out there for us, which is fantastic. So don't think you always have to be watching the newest thing. You don't have to be watching The Boys for your comic entertainment on TV, and you don't have to be watching the latest Westerns that are out there. You can watch the originals and see what those were like. So anyway, that's my soapbox. So anyone have anything else to add or any questions on any of that?
Yeah, so I just want to say thanks, Buck, for that, because I admit I glossed over like why comic books at this time. Like,
Yeah.
I just thought, oh, it's just the thing, I didn't know much about comic books.
Yeah.
I've taught a superheroes class. It was about contemporary superhero movies in particular. And we talk when I talk about the comics in that, I talk about how many of the original superhero comics are the ones that got adapted into movies, at least at the beginning. It was all about origin stories, always about the beginning.
Yes.
And in that sense, one of the things that we talk about is this transference of rather traditional ideas of what it means to be an American or morality or whatever. So I always think of like early comics as like super American values, like very
Yes.
traditional values. And so this really helped me think about this. What's so interesting about these all these Orson Welles radio broadcasts is like it's always these moments of transition that we're
Yes.
getting here, because she's not freaking out about, to be clear, I think from your history, she's not really freaking out about Superman. She's not really freaking out about, anything that you might think unless you
Right.
really know comics. This is a change in comics. So that's actually really helpful for me. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah, and the whole thing was the cover.
Yeah.
That would sell the thing, right? So you want your cover to stand out. So when they started going with horror, it started being who could make the most dramatic cover? Oh, there's someone walking with a severed head in their hands on the cover. Well, that sells better. And so they're like, okay, who can take it further and further and further? And of course, as the adult looking at it, you see those covers, and even if the comics inside aren't as gory as the cover, you judge it by its cover and go, "Oh my gosh, look at where comics are going." When you had pictures of Superman fighting Nazis and things, it was like, okay, that's patriotic, that's great. But then in 46, 47, when you started to get into horror stuff that was there, that's when they really started to crack down, and you could see why. Yeah. Anyway.
But yeah, Frances Zell did not read. I'm sure she did not read these actual comics. The other thing I was thinking is, like you
No.
said, it's the cover.
It's the cover.
Probably
It's the
just
cover.
saw the newsstand. And it's so interesting that historian James Gilbert wrote a book called Cycles of Outrage, which show with the expansion of many medium reaching into children's markets, about every 10 years, somebody's going to get upset about, oh, the children, save the children. And this concern about the excesses of the covers is so similar to pre-code Hollywood, because many times it was the posters being showed of unclad women and scary monsters, monsters
Yes.
and gangsters. It was the violence and extreme colors and pulchritudinous flesh of the posters that got the conservatives so angry at the movies. They didn't even watch the movies. They just took, riding down the street, seeing the posters, got upset. So similarly, these critics are just seeing these sort of outrageous covers, which, as you say, how are you going to top the last one? How are you going to top the last one? Build up to these things.
Well, and then too, so often they're looking to blame something on because they're getting more juvenile delinquency, and they're going, it must be tied to something. Why are we having this? Well, the reality is, after the war, there's so many people going for so many jobs. Some young people can't find jobs, can't find work. So what do? Young people tend to start stealing things if they can't get money, and they tend to start hanging out at places and causing trouble, because that's what people do when they don't have something to keep them busy. And so it doesn't mean it's because of comic books. It means it's because the situation was you've got all these folks coming back from war that are taking up all the jobs, and the young people that are 16, 17 probably can't find jobs right at the time.
So it's a kind of temporary situation.
Yes.
And I really like how Orson says, he does sort of say, it's not the comics that are to blame. But this, and of course, I like the part where he says, pay teachers more. So
yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Teaching, yep. And so it goes all the way back to then. I was going to say too, and even through the 50s, you have the startings of the middle class and upper class going on, and things where the kids maybe don't have to work as much as they used to, and they're not maybe where in the Depression era, once your kid got old enough, they needed to either be generating money for the home or going out on their own. They couldn't just hang out and things, where in the 50s it starts to be the first generation where they can kind of hang out, and they can wait till they're 18, 19, 20 to start out their lives and things. So they've got these teen years where they can start acting up and doing more things, and that continues up into the hippies in the 60s and so forth. And they're always looking for somebody to blame. For a while it was comic books, and then it got away from comic books and it became television, and it became even radio got a lot of the different radio show suspense and things got some blowback from your creating juvenile delinquents through what you're presenting to us and things. But yeah.
I mean, I love this section. I feel like this is if you're gonna listen to this one even just halfway or even a quarter way, this goes about 5 or 6 minutes.
Yeah.
It's really good because I always love the letter when Orson, especially when he starts with the letter, because it's going to be one of two things. He always chooses these letters for some rhetorical, argumentative reason. It's different. Oh, we just chose a letter and we're going to give you a radio. It's like, I'm either going to berate you and use you as an example of something I don't like. Oh, I'll give you a radio. Or I love what you're doing and it supports everything that I have to say about politics. And so we have that, of course, here. This poor writer, Francis Zell, is basically the example of the first one, which is like, I think everything you're saying is wrong. I think it's everything that's wrong with America, in fact.
Yeah.
And so, I thought it was weird. So, but, for context, you'll get this when you listen. But she basically says, listen, comic books are terrible. They lead to juvenile delinquency. And she gives very typical examples that are always anecdotal and very small. It's like, oh, I know of 3 specific instances in which bodily harm came from reading comic books. Also, there's some random judge down the street who says that comic books are the bane of American existence. And then she says, well, what do you think about this? And I thought my initial thought was maybe she was just writing to anyone she was listening to, but why Orson Welles? That was the first thing that I asked myself, because on two hands, I think there's 2 possibilities here. One is she could see him as a bastion for what even Wells says. Well, sometimes you need to show kids that there are better things in the world. That's partly, what he's done. He's known as an artist, as a socialite, as an educated person who, whose radio broadcasts in particular were meant to engage with classical examples of literature and adapt them for, popular audiences. He was also in the theater, much more sort of serious theater, not comic theater, things like that. So maybe on that hand. On the other hand, this shadow of War of the Worlds is behind him as a prankster, as a hoaxster, as a jokester, as somebody who causes mass problems, who basically is himself a juvenile delinquent. And so she must not have been thinking about that angle, because I was like, she would never choose him if that's really what she was thinking about. So, it's maybe evidence of something which she always wanted, to be taken very seriously as a politician, as a political thinker, as an artist. And so maybe, it's not behind him by any means. Everyone always mentions War of the Worlds, but maybe that's why she wrote. So the other thing, though, is, he uses it. This is an example of doing 2 things that he's always for, and I really appreciate. One is about education and education reform, as Kathy mentioned, pay the teachers more. The teachers are really important, but also, like, he says something like, oh, you need to, engage the students. And this is something that I think comes from Wells's own childhood. He was a child of privilege in many ways. He didn't go to a traditional school. He went to Todd Boys School, which is a reform school, where they did try to pick up on what are you interested in? How can we engage you in all sorts of issues through that thing that you're interested in. And so he was interested in theater. He was interested in art at that time. And so this school was so open. They were like, hey, you're interested in art, but you also need to learn history. So why don't you paint a mural of all the important places in world history in the pool, in the natatorium? And that's what Wells did. And so he's like learning history, and he could put on plays. And so for him, this is an excuse to be like, listen, I think this is how it was great. This is what I think is engaging. It's not just about boring facts, that you're jammed down people's throat. And so he's really pushing for engaged, critical thinking based education. And he says that will solve your juvenile delinquent problem. And if that doesn't solve it, like you were saying, Buck, it's also about social and economic issues, which is like, you don't have good housing, you don't have enough money, you don't have jobs, you're going to go and do other things that are going to cause problems. And so it's not about, these comic books. But it's like Kathy said, I really like these cycles of outrage. But, also I think this is an important time, Kathy, we've talked about it on other episodes, where that argument has pseudo evidence that's on a larger scale, right? With the pain studies, people think that there's real evidence that this causes problems, that juvenile delinquency comes from movies in particular. I mean, we know now that those studies were largely debunked for those reasons. They did show a connection between, you can learn things from movies, you can get education, but they did not show that movies corrupt the youth. They did not show that books, that did the same thing. In a very recent sense, more and more people think that video games cause violence, particularly with gun violence. There is some evidence, there are some studies that have shown links between that, but they are highly contested and highly problematic. In fact, one scholar lost their PhD because they found a couple years ago that their studies proving there was a connection between gun violence and video games was doctored. And her advisor is also very controversial in this. And so in all sorts of media modes, it's really been disproven or highly questionable that there's any real link. And so, Wells sort of moves up over that, but he just I don't think there's any evidence. I don't think censorship is good. The other thing that I want to mention, though, I thought was hilarious is, she's asked him, how do we solve this problem? And he quickly, this is a small thing, you'll miss it if you don't listen to it twice like I did. He actually gives her the playbook for how to solve this. He's like, well, you shouldn't really solve this with censorship. Prohibition was horrible, didn't get anybody to stop drinking. But what would stop this? National boycotts. He's like, if you can get all the parents and all the teachers and all these, and the government to boycott this, they'll probably go away. And we see that a little bit with what you're mentioning with the censorship, which is not really boycotting, but you get some control. But we have seen even recently where boycotts do cause at least temporary change, where you can really boycott something and hurt somebody in their wallet and they'll back off. Whether they should or not is not something I'll debate here. But at the same time, he's like, this is how you do it. Period. You do that, this will all go away. If you stop buying those comics, if everybody stops buying those comics, everything you hate will just disappear. And so I love that
because he describes it like, well, I don't believe in censorship, but if you boycott and everybody stops buying these, then they will, like you say, will go away. But essentially that's censorship in some ways too. It's like,
sure.
It's so,
but using capitalism,
yes.
to get what you want.
And then the fact that, Orson, I was like, okay, how is Orson going to approach this? And he pretty much goes down the center with it. He sort of gives him, well, if you really want it to go away, you could do this. I think comics suck is sort of what he says. But then he talks about how great comic strips are. And so he's sort of going on every side of it. And he's judging something he doesn't even. No. If he likes comic strips, he would probably like some of the comic books that were being produced at that time because they were more serious than the previous comics. But anyway.
But I just don't think he knew comic books, like you said. I mean, I think that's the issue here, because rhetorically in his argument, he's pushing against censorship and he's pushing against people decrying young people's things. And so I think the only thing he does know are the comic strips. And so he goes on this long list, like you said at the beginning. Oh, I know 10 comics, and you know what? Comic strips, and I know them really well. And he goes into small little details. The one that jumped out to, go ahead, Kathy, go ahead.
I love that he had to have his Terry and the Pirates snipped out of newspapers and sent to him in South America.
Yeah, I discovered something from that was shocking to me. So one of my earliest essays that I ever wrote and presented and stuff was about The Lady from Shanghai, which is a film he makes around this time. Famous noir film with famous femme fatale, who has loose connections to the Orient and things like that. I realized that part of that is from Around the World in 80 Days, which I've talked about in the past, as sort of Orientalist, anyway. But I realized that the woman in Terry and the Pirates, the main one, who's the something, I can't remember, I'm forgetting what her name is. It's the Dragon Lady, which of course is a famous trope, is the character in The Lady from Shanghai. She, almost identical. It looks exactly like what he made Rita Hayworth's hair look like in it. She controls this band of at first Chinese pirates who are evil, and then they have to change that when the war happens because suddenly the Chinese aren't supposed to be evil and they're against the Japanese. Yeah. But I realized that character is almost exactly out of Terry and the Pirates. And so Terry and the Pirates, The Lady from Shanghai, the same thing, deeply influential, and came from this. I really didn't know that Wells was so into comic strips. So thank you, Commentaries. Yeah. Thank you, podcast. It was great.
Yeah, it's great. to me, I mean, obviously we've gone on, this is probably the longest one we've done in ages, but his podcast, his podcast, our podcast, his show is so interesting because you just never know where it's going to go. And this is the first one. Sometimes you'll never, and the reason we like deep dive on something like this, we don't deep dive as much, say, on the atomic bomb, because we presented a little, it's presented over weeks and weeks and weeks, so we have plenty of time to talk about it. This is like the one shot at comics that we get in this whole run. I don't think he ever mentions comics again, or if he does, it's very light. It's nothing like this. So we just are going to jump on it when something like that presents itself. And I did this by myself last time, and so it was pretty much as involved as this one was. I don't think I didn't have the visuals and everything that I did this time, but I wanted to redo it again with both of you folks, because I just think you guys have such interesting things to add to it, and would point out the other parts that aren't about comics, because the comic piece is fairly short in this. It's like you say 5 minutes of it or something. But anyway, a great episode for folks to enjoy. Did we cover everything? Do we need anything else? Is that pretty good, or we're good? All right, we'll end that there. And you already heard the episode. This is one of those where you're like very happy we present Orson's episode first and then us, because when you get sick of us, you can just turn us off. But remember, after this, stay tuned, if you're still with us, to watch the episode of Tales from the Crypt, the very first episode. And we'll see you folks next time.
Poor little fellas. When I think of their childhood, all those cute little maggots. Our story is about a man with nobler ambitions. He likes to kill human pests, and he does it in front of an audience. Now that's entertainment. So hang on to your hats, kiddies. This one's a real shocker.
This here is Charlie Ledbetter, sitting in his cell out the state penitentiary. It's long about midnight. Charlie's gonna die in a few minutes. One thing Mr. Ledbetter ain't thinking about is Joe Saylor, his old boss. You see, one day Charlie had a half pint of vodka for lunch. He got to thinking about how they turned him down when he wanted that raise. Now, he felt real bad about that, old Charlie did. He'd been working there for about 7 years, and he didn't have too much to show for it. So he went down and got his cold blue 44 out of the glove box of his Chevy, took it up to Mr. Saylor's office. 2 slugs went into Saylor, 3 went wild. Last one went right through a glass wall into a secretary that's passing by. Got it right behind the ear. Killed her big as hell. Kind of a lucky shot, really. About the only kind of luck Charlie Ledbetter ever had. I guess right about now, Charlie Ledbetter's starting to think pretty serious about that Valley of Death. He's thinking about that rubber diaper they give him to wear. Wondering if he's gonna crap all over himself when I juice him in a couple minutes. He will. First thing you got to understand is when it's their time, all these big tough guys go yellow. Crying and hollering and screaming, blubbering the governor's gonna call and all that. Well, I've been here 12 years and the governor ain't called yet. People say the damnedest things about electrocutions. They say your eyeballs pop out, they say black blood comes out your mouth. They say you get all foamy like a rabid dog. All that's bullshit. It ain't true at all. Nice thing about electricity is it's clean. Of course, I have seen a few heads smoke after it's all over. Smoking head ain't very pretty.
Wait a minute! Yes, wait a minute! He's gonna call! The governor's gonna call! He's gonna give me a state! Yes, he will! No! The governor's gonna call! He's got to! He's got to!
I'll knock it off, Charlie. You're being some damn chicken shit. You killed somebody, now you're gonna do the hot squat. It all evens out, don't it, baby?
Why are you doing this?
You know, people tell me most executioners never look the prisoners in the eye. Afraid they're gonna get spooked or something. Not me. I always look. Okay, Mr. Ledbetter. Now you're all ready for your Regulation 2 jolts the state requires.
I think we should proceed now. There's been a word from the governor.
Yes, sir. We're all set.
Let us pray. As I enter here with a sense of my own unworthiness, O Lord Jesus Christ, abiding in happiness, may the blessings of God and unmixed joy accompany you.
No! It's not right!
Let no evil spirit.
No! No! It ain't right!
To do, unworthy though I be, may my entry be blessed by you who are holy, you who are merciful, you who abide with the Father.
They say electric current's so fast the brain gets cooked just as soon as the switch is throwed. Prisoner never feels a thing. Boy, I'd hate to think that was true. I'm a country boy, but I like the city. You know? It's big, it's dirty, lets you know what it really is. But at night, there's all those lights. It's real pretty, isn't it? My name's Niles Talbot. I've been the executioner in this state for the last 12 years. When I got here from Oklahoma, I caught on as an electrician, and after a while, I got a job out to the prison, taking care of the generators. I like electricity. It's dependable. You can trust it. Let's say do it with gas or with some lethal injection. I don't take to that. That's how you kill a dog or a cat or something, not a man. It's gotta be the old electric chair for me.
Special agents called Coyote Busters. The effort, which often includes agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, and other federal agencies...
Cheese sandwich, honey. Cup of coffee black.
...agreement. Elsewhere today, the legislature is prepared to vote whether or not to rescind the death penalty in this state, only a few hours after the execution of Charles Ledbetter. Opponents of the bill claim the death penalty has proven an effective deterrent against violent crime, and its abolition will only push the crime rate higher and produce more overcrowding in our prisons. Many also claim that execution is still murder in the eyes of God.
Terribly sorry, Niles.
Hey, Listen, it wasn't your fault. Nothing you could do. I gotta admit, the damn thing caught me by surprise.
Well, if you'd like, I can write you a letter of recommendation.
Yeah, well, I was kind of hoping I'd get my old job back. I mean, you still need somebody to look after the generators down at the powerhouse.
We already have someone for that, Niles. Hey, you remember you trained him.
Now, listen, I've been working here a lot of years. I mean, 2 in an electric shop, another 12 throwing a switch for the state. Don't seniority count for something?
It's not that, Niles. It's just that, well, we thought it wouldn't be good to have you around the prisoners. I mean, they all knew what you did. I mean, they all knew you were the man who could get pretty ugly.
Listen, it's nothing I can't handle. Somebody gets out of line, I'd take care of myself.
I can't let it come to that, Niles. I'm sure if you think about it, you'll understand.
Yeah, I understand. I guess this ain't the kind of work they give you a gold watch for, is it? One thing a man needs is a friend. Someone to talk to when you're feeling down and out. I suppose that's why they invented bars, you know? You nurse a drink, you think things over, have a little chat. All of a sudden, things ain't quite as bad as they seem. Most barroom conversations is either about baseball, football, boxing, or pussy. But with me, it's different. People usually want to talk to me about my job. I guess I ought to say my ex-job.
This one's on me, Mr. Talbot. This goddamn criminal. I can't believe those chicken shit politicians really did it. After all those years of service, and they canned you like you were some fucking guinea off the boat, you know? I hate to see talent go to waste. It's a fucking shame.
Thank you, Vic. You're a real buddy.
Well, they're doing lots of shows on TV about the whole thing.
TV people don't know nothing. They want to do something good. What they really ought to do is they ought to put a lot of little TVs in all the cells of all the prisons, you know, closed circuit, so that all the guys who's locked up can watch their buddy when he gets cooked. Now, that might be a real education.
Hell, I'd watch it.
There's this editorial on TV, and the commentators saying how if they televised executions, the whole country would just stop the death penalty. They'd all be too sick from it. They wouldn't let it happen again.
Fucking guys on TV. What do they know? Yeah?
Let me tell you something. They put executions on TV, be the fucking highest rated show of all time. Be Nielsen's through the roof. Other networks would start killing people just to compete. Pretty soon, Geraldo Rivera be pulling that switch.
It's all a big food chain. We eat shit, and the shit eats us. They canned me from my job because they're afraid of me. They're afraid of death. They don't see it's all around them. It's a disease. You eat it, you drink it, you breathe it, you fuck it. We're all pregnant with it. Growing inside all of us.
Like them, over there. You see those two junkies? Pitiful bastards, ain't they?
I'll tell you something, though. In a way, I respect them. They're honest. They spend all the money they can get just to shoot a little death into their arms. Just for a thrill. Just get a little taste of the grave. See, they know death is coming. They tease it. I like that. Because at the same time, junkies are shit. Two-bit criminals.
Upon examination of sworn testimony, it would appear that the state has a strong case for the prosecution of James Flood for the crime of murder. However, having reviewed the district attorney's case, I find that the warrant for arrest has been improperly worded. I'm afraid I must rule that there are no grounds on which to prosecute James Flood. Mr. Flood, you are free to leave.
Yeah! Objection, Your Honor. Your Honor, I object. This is a travesty of justice. Because of a simple clerical error, you're letting this man go free.
Order in the court. This case is dismissed.
Your Honor, I would like to petition immediately to the appellate court for a review.
Order in this court. Order in the court. Son of a bitch, you killed my brother! Order in this court.
Back, will you? Your brother, the prison was a fact.
Hey, that bitch.
I got nothing special against bikers. Hell, I used to own a hog myself once upon a time. Bikers believe in freedom. They don't want nobody to lean on them, and they don't give a good goddamn what polite society thinks of. See, they figure they're throwbacks to real Americans. You know what the country was all about before it all went to hell, with big city lawyers and computers, corporations, time clocks, and what all. There's a lot to be said for that. Those ain't bad ideas. But this biker, Jimmy Flood, now he went way out of line. And he ought to pay.
May have been responsible for the freak accident which claimed the life of alleged murderer Jimmy Flood. Flood, often characterized in the press as a motorcycle hoodlum based on his lifestyle.
Can you
and
believe that?
record.
And some people say there's no God.
Sure there's a God. No doubt about it. Problem is he spends too much time making assholes like that biker.
And I know what you mean. He looks like a real creep to me. You know how on TV they get these experts, you know, the ACLU types, and they're always saying that it's only the minorities that get the chair. Did you ever notice that?
And they're all pretty dark when I get done with them, Vic.
Yeah, yeah.
Will the defendants please rise? Will the jury foreman please read the verdict?
In the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendants, Cynthia Baldwin and Theodore Carney, not guilty.
The defendants have been found innocent of all charges and are free to resume their private lives. This court is adjourned.
I'm very happy for you.
It's over.
Oh, thank God.
This fella, Carney, decides to unload his wife in favor of this little hotski that he had on the side. But his old lady had all the loot in her name, so he figured that divorce wasn't quite good enough. I know where his head is at. We all do. Right down there between his legs.
You know, I gotta say this for old Carney. If you gonna do it, make sure she's worth doing it for. And this girl of his is awful pretty. Of course, everybody knows beauty's only skin deep. Looks just don't last.
Here.
My God! Who are you?
Look, I have $200 in my wallet. It's in my pants in the other room.
I have some money in my purse. Please, take it. Just don't hurt us.
Keep it. I ain't here for your money.
I don't get it. What do you want?
I find you both guilty of the murder of your former wife, Mr. Carney.
Were you a friend of hers? Who are you?
And I sentence you to death. That sentence to be carried out immediately.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Those heads
idea. I didn't know he'd really go through with it.
Shut up,
You
Cynthia.
gotta believe me.
Shut up, Cynthia. No, wait, no.
I never had no problem with women. If I wanted one, I just went out and got her. Easy peasy Japanese. Here, honey. They just want you to love them, is all. That's all they ever want. They get that from their mamas, from all the trashy magazines they read. It's easy to be successful with dames. Just don't fall in love and you're okay. You give them what they want, you fall in love. They'll kill you. They can't stain you no more. They either dump you and move on, or if they let you hang around, they cut your balls off. Weird, ain't it? Now, as far as strategies for getting into their panties, that's easy, too. The old rule, you treat whores like queens and queens like whores, you got no problem. They're on their backs faster than you can say, son of Sam. Oh, look at those honeys. And up there, you got the queen bitch herself. Just what the doctor ordered for you. You might have fooled that jury, but you didn't fool me none. I wonder how you're gonna dance when I put 10,000 volts through your ass. We're gonna have ourselves one dead little go-go dancer. Well, honey, it's your time. Goddamn hell is going on here?
Mr. Talbot, you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. I got some good news for you, Mr. Talbot. Since you're such a staunch supporter of capital punishment, you'll be glad to know the state legislature has just reinstated the death penalty. And guess who's not pulling the switch this time?
Yeah!
Just a government call, yeah? Listen, you just delay this thing just a couple of minutes. That's all I'm asking for, just a few damn minutes. Come on now, I'm not like the other ones. You know me. You won't know me. I used to work here, for Christ's sakes. Come on, I'm telling you, the government's gonna call. He knows what I done for him. He knows about all the rats and all the fucking crumbs that I took care of. All the shit that they wanted me to get rid of. Come on, man! You gotta let me go, you son of a bitch! That phone is gonna ring! I'm telling you, he's gonna call. He's gonna call, he knows. And when he does, if you juice me before he fucking calls, you're all gonna get canned! You hear me? You shields! I didn't do nothing that you didn't want. I didn't do nothing you didn't go along with. All I did was something you wanted you chicken shit to do yourself. You miserable chicken shit bastards! Chicken shit fuckers! You can't do this to me! Let me out of here!
Niles, I'm terribly sorry it's come to this.
job. That's why I did it, because it's my job. If a man ain't good at his job, then what the hell is he good for? What's anything good for?
In grace, aeterna felicitas, divina prosperitas, serena laetitia, caritas, colosa, sanitas semper in Magnifica Domine super nos nomen.
I didn't want no haircut. They said that was a mistake because my head might catch on fire from the electricity when they juice me. I told them, don't worry. The governor gonna call.
Good. What a revolting development. And what a switch for poor Talbot. It just goes to show you what happens when you get too caught up in your work. Don't worry, though. I'm sure he never knew what hit him. So remember, boys and girls, safety first.